Welcome to Bootstrap 101, and in this course, as mentioned in the introduction video, we're going to be learning Bootstrap by reading the documentation, which is extremely important. So whenever you use a new API or a new service and you have a question, the first place you want to look is the documentation. And a lot of times people don't do that. They ask their friends, they ask their mentors, they ask Facebook groups, and really the best place to ask any question is always the documentation first. Always go to the docs first. And so in this course, this is what we're going to be doing, is we're going to be learning Bootstrap by experimenting with the documentation. And the reason we're doing that specifically with Bootstrap is because the Bootstrap docs are really, really good. Now, before we get started, one thing to take note of here is that we are using Bootstrap 5 Beta 1. So in the future, let's say we get to Bootstrap 5.3 and something has changed a little bit. Again, this is why we're learning how to read docs, is because sometimes when someone records a video, like a teacher such as me records a video about, let's say, CSS or JavaScript or Bootstrap, and technology changes pretty rapidly, you might want to be able to reference the documentation and figure out exactly what has changed. Now, I don't foresee a lot of changes happening with Bootstrap 5 coming out of Beta 1 and going into a proper version. Now, if anything does change between Beta 1 and let's say 5.1, 5.2, 5.3, anything major, you'll be completely prepared. And this module, this Bootstrap 101 module, is all about teaching you how to be prepared while learning Bootstrap. So let's head on over to getbootstrap.com and let's go over to the docs. And this stands for documentation. Now, the first thing you want to look at is basically the introduction, the installation rules in the documentation. This is going to help you get set up with any sort of project in the future, not just Bootstrap, but any project out there. So we're going to be using getbootstrap.com for a lot of what we're going to be learning in this module. So make sure you have internet access and that you can go to getbootstrap.com. Okay, let's get started with Bootstrap. So first thing I did was I went to getbootstrap.com and clicked on the docs. Your page might look a little bit different from mine. I'm zoomed in so that this looks, half decent in a video, especially if you're watching this on like a tablet or a phone. At least you can see it, hopefully. Whereas the site usually on my computer looks like this. So I'm just zoomed in a little bit here. And if I click over to the docs, we can see we can get started. There's customization, layout, content, forms, components, helpers, utilities, extend, and about, plus migration from older versions of Bootstrap. Now, if you're already familiar with Bootstrap, let's say Bootstrap 3, Bootstrap 4, and you want to start learning Bootstrap 5, dive right into the docs and go straight to the migration area. The migration area is going to tell you basically what's changed and how to basically write modern Bootstrap. But this lesson is not about migration. This lesson is about getting started. So let's click Getting Started and go into Introduction. Now, what we want to do here is read through this. Now, I'm not going to just read through this because you can read through this on your own. You're a fully capable human being, and I know you know how to do that. But let's go through the introduction steps anyway. I'm just not going to read this verbatim because that's going to be super boring for you. So first things first, let's go to the quick start, and we need CSS. So what Bootstrap is basically this library that lets you do a lot of things with CSS and a little bit of JavaScript, and you don't have to write all of your own CSS and JavaScript. It's pre-compiled, it's pre-made for you. You just need to learn the rules of this. And this is called a library or a framework. So the first thing you need to do for your project is copy this. And yours might not say 5.0.0-beta 1, yours might say something different. But basically you just want to copy that link and you want to put that into your HTML in your head. And there's an example on this page I'll show you in just a little bit. So you're going to want to make sure you have that. And if you're not using any JavaScript, you don't need to add any JavaScript. But if you are going to use JavaScript, such as like a modal, a little pop-up window inside of your page, then you're going to need to add some JavaScript. And for that, we just want to go in here and copy this stuff, the separate part. And you're going to want Popper.js and Bootstrap 5. Again, that version might be a little bit different. This version here, Core 2.5.4, might be a little bit different for you depending on the time that you're watching this video. But regardless, you can just copy that, and that's going to put it in your clipboard, and you can paste that into your project at any point in time. So in these docs, there's a lot of different things that we are going to skip over. So like Sass, which is a way to compile your CSS We're not going to get into that just because this is more of a Bootstrap course and less of a Sass course. So if we go down, we can see that there's an example here. Doc type HTML, that's HTML5. We put the CSS in our head element. We should be familiar with that already. And our JavaScript always goes at the bottom of our body. So we put our content in here and we put our JavaScript down here. And the reason we do that is because we want our browser, which loads things from top to bottom, to load all of our HTML content, as much as possible anyways, and then load our JavaScript. And the reason for that is because JavaScript, if it gets initiated too early, and let's say it's looking for this H1, it might not find it because the browser hasn't loaded it yet. Now, that's not really a problem with modern internet, with fast internet, but if you're in a place with slow internet, or if you're on a phone with slow internet, that could be a problem. So we always put our JavaScript at the very bottom of our page, or those two that we were looking at earlier, we would put them at the very bottom here. This is just in an HTML comment. Just make sure you don't put it in an HTML comment, just like this. There is a second way to do this, but before we even move on to the download instructions, let's go ahead and take a look at the responsive meta. So you need this, absolutely you need this. This is what's going to make your page responsive. If your page isn't responsive, there's no point using Bootstrap. And what responsive means, basically, is that it's going to snap to look different on either mobile, like a phone, tablet, a laptop, desktop, TV, etc., etc. So it's going to be completely responsive. So you could have something that takes up this entire width on a large screen like my laptop here, or it could snap into like two different rows. Instead of just one big row, we see one row here. It could snap into two different rows using a phone, for instance. And that just makes it so that you can scroll a little bit easier on a phone and you don't have to scroll left and right. And it just looks better that way. Now there's a bunch of things in here like box sizing, which we don't have to go into. If you want to, you can definitely read through it. If you want to get really good at Bootstrap, honestly, just read through the docs. It shouldn't take very long. You could probably read through everything in this documentation in about an hour or two on your own. It's a little bit dry, so I'm going to skip through some of the dry stuff and just get you up and running quickly. Now, I mentioned that there's a second way to basically get Bootstrap up and running, and that's to download it. You can download the CSS and the JavaScript and you can host it yourself. Or what I like to do is use a CDN, so a content delivery network. And a content delivery network basically allows you to host this on your website, or not host it on your website, but to serve it from your website. And the nice thing about this is if someone has already downloaded this from another website, they don't have to re-download it on your website. So it's going to load even quicker. And with a content delivery network, even if they haven't downloaded it before from another website, if their browser hasn't downloaded it before from another website, it's going to get the closest location. So if your server is in, let's say, the United Kingdom, but you are in America, instead of having to make this request, so basically you're downloading this file from the UK all the way down to the United States, instead of having to do that traveling, it could find a content delivery network or basically a mainframe that's closer to you. So it could go from, let's say you're in Seattle, it could find one in San Francisco, rather than having to cross halfway across the globe and download it, send it all the way through the internet wires. It just saves a lot of time. So you can go from Seattle to San Francisco. It's significantly faster. So that's a benefit of using a CDN. Now, if you want to get into customization, you're going to want to download this on your own and host it on your own. We're not going to get into too much customization at this point in time. Now, there's a bunch of other stuff in here. I'm going to quickly go through some of it. Maybe actually not. Let's not go through some of it just because this gets a little more advanced and gets into customization. And again, we're not customizing Bootstrap at this point in time. We're learning how to use Bootstrap and how to read docs. One thing you are going to see a lot of is RTL. That's right to left. So in some languages, they write their language from right to left. We go from left to right, so it goes this way. In some languages, they go the other way, and so there's RTL support. By default, everything is left to right, LTR, left to right, but you can, if you wanted to, switch that to right to left if your language needs it to be from right to left. If you're already familiar with Webpack, you can use Webpack, you can install Webpack. and you can install Bootstrap using Node and NPM. You can do all sorts of stuff with it. It's completely customizable. Everything you see here can be changed, but again, we're not going to get into that too much. So moving forward, what we're going to do in the next lesson is we are going to skip right over to utilities, and we're going to walk through each of the utilities, each one of these in here, one by one. And then I'm going to show you how to create a layout. And we're going to need to know what some of these utilities are to be familiar with layout. So without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into that next lesson where we look at utilities. All right, let's take a look at some of the utilities here. Let's just get started with this. So I'm on getbootstrap.com. I go over to docs. We already dealt with the getting started, how to get that up and running in your project. Let's go ahead and jump straight to utilities. And there's an API in here. Let's read this API. Now, some of this may or may not be completely applicable to us at this point in time, and that depends on your skill level. So when you see a $ like this is usually a SAS or SCSS, SASS. You see that here, SASS. It's a way to compile CSS, and so that we can basically have programming inside of CSS, which CSS doesn't come with for the most part. There's all sorts of stuff in here. Here's a good example. Utilities, opacity, you can change that opacity, you can change the property value, and the values can be different things in here. Again, we're not going to get too far into customization, but this is really good to know when you get really advanced with Bootstrap. And you know, if you work for an agency down the road, you're going to be customizing Bootstrap like this. But again, that's a subject for another day. You don't have to worry about that right now. So moving forward, we're going to see these things called utilities, and utility is basically just CSS. So it says like opacity -0, and that's going to make an element completely see-through, or opacity 75, and it's going to be 75% visible. That means it's going to be 25% see-through, and we see that with opacity -75 or opacity -50. We could add more in here if we wanted to customize it. Again, we're not going to customize, but you can customize it. So if your project needed opacity 90%, you could just add another item in here in your JavaScript, in your values. And just under the 75 here, you could put 90:0.9, and that will give you opacity -90. And this is more about the, here we go. This is more about the API. So if you wanted to customize, again, and I can't stress this enough, we're not going to get into customization because that's a whole new can of worms, and that's a completely different subject. But if we wanted to, we could change it from opacity, which is what we saw up here, to just the letter O. And if we come up here, we can actually see that by default it's just opacity, but we could change that class name to O, and it's just going to output O-0, so opacity 0, or O-100, opacity is 1. There's different states and stuff in here, and honestly, this is getting into a lot of customization. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to hop out of this video, and we're going to jump right into borders. Let's talk about borders. So sometimes you want to add a border to things in your page just to make them look nice. For instance, this navigation bar up here has a bottom border. It's very, very thin, but it gives it that nice little separation. So you know that there's this nav bar with search in here that floats down the page with you. Now to add a border, first of all, there's additive and there's subtractive. So additive borders are basically, you have a span here like this, and you just add a border. Or if you just want top, or like this nav bar up here, just border bottom. And you can see these very plainly. So there's 5 instances here, and there's 5 pieces of code here. And what I like to do is not only just read the docs, but if you're reading the docs for a front-end library or framework, you can always just right-click, go to inspect, and you can see how this is being used. So if I make this just a touch bigger, and I'll move that up, what I did was I right-clicked on the element, inspected it, and it showed me border. Now if I scroll down a little bit, you're going to see border top, border end, border bottom, border start. So in Bootstrap, when you see things like start and end, start always means either left or top, depending on your element or your utility. And end means either the right or the bottom, again, depending on your utility. We'll see more of this in the future. But if we just wanted to add border top here, we could see that right there. If we click on that, and over here in styles, we can filter by border top. And it says border top, that's the class name here, border top 1 pixel solid, hash DEE 2E6 important. So it's going to add that top border there for us. That's additive. So by default, there are no borders. Now, if we keep scrolling down, there's also subtractive, which means we could add a border. And let's get right into the nitty gritty here. Border top 0. What this is doing is saying there is a border, but there is no border on the top. And so again, if we just filter by border top over here and scroll on down, border top 0 says border top 0 important. And what that's going to do is make sure that there is absolutely no border on the top ever. You can do the same thing with border end, border bottom, and border start, or just take away a border altogether. So let's go ahead and close this down. Now there's also border colors, and Bootstrap comes with a lot of different colors by default. It comes with primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark, and white. And this just allows you to, by default, have a nice little color palette to work with. And again, these are customizable. If you wanted to customize these down the road, you absolutely could do that. We're not going to get into customization, but it does come with primary being blue, secondary being whatever that color is, which is really hard to see because that's really, really thin. But what we can do is, again, just right click, inspect, and we can see that this one is border secondary. Let's type in our filter here, border color, and we can see that this color is hash 6C757D. We're going to get more into colors in the next video, so we'll be able to see these a little bit better. But if you ever wanted to add a border color, all you have to do is add the class called border and a secondary class called border primary or border light if you wanted to. And it gives you all these different examples in here in the documentation. And this is a good reason why you should always look at documentation. Good documentation and being able to read and understand good documentation is one of the key skills of a great developer. Now scrolling down, we can change the border width as well, but let's go ahead and have some fun with this. So we have border width 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and in Bootstrap you're going to see this 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5 quite a bit, and you'll see it in the next number of videos. But if we just right-click, inspect, this one has a border of 4, but let's change that border color so we can add that. And all I did there, by the way, was I just double-clicked, and you can type border dash primary, and that changes it to blue. Or you can edit that again and change it from border primary to border secondary, and that just changes it to the secondary color. Or border dark, and that changes it to black. And so basically all we do in Bootstrap is we add some sort of base class and then a modifier. So we have a base border, that's our first one here, and then we said the border needs to be a little bit thicker, border dash 1, whatever that value is going to be. So it'll be between 1 and 5, and then we can add border colors. Now we could get even further into that with border radius. And so here's a bunch of examples using images. The first one is just saying that the class is rounded. And the second one is rounded top, that's up here, so it's rounding here and right there. Rounding end simply means the right side, so top right, bottom right. Rounded bottom, bottom left, bottom right. Start is top left, bottom right. Or if we wanted to make a circle or a pill, we can make a circle or a pill. Now let's go ahead and add a border to this. Let's have some fun with this. So we have this image in here. And this is an SVG. Which one do we want here? Where am I? This one. So we can see it's a placeholder image, rounded start. Is that the one we want? No, let's work on the next one. Rounded circle. And let's say this has a border, border 3, and border primary. And look what that does. It adds a nice blue border around it. So I'm dynamically changing my HTML inside of my inspect tool. And again, all I did was right click and go to inspect. And you can change those class names by double clicking on the class element, or the class attribute rather, and just changing or removing things. So you can get hands-on experience at any point in time throughout this course. Now there's also sizes in here. If we wanted to round or not round a lot, we could have a rounded border radius of 0, or just a little bit more, or a little bit more than that. And again, you see this recurring pattern here. So it says rounded dash 0, rounded dash 1, rounded dash 2, rounded dash 3. Now what I would like you to do as a fun little experiment is right click, inspect on an element, and let's inspect this SVG and change that class. And I want you to add a border color around it and a border thickness. Go ahead and try to add a border to one of these images here. Okay, let's talk about colors. This is very important because if you want a site that doesn't look plain and boring, you want some colors. Like Bootstrap uses this nice purple. So let's go down, and while we're reading docs, we always want to read these fun little things that stick out like this. Dealing with specificity. Sometimes contextual classes cannot be applied due to the specificity of another selector. Now what that means is sometimes you can't add a particular class because another class is going to overwrite it. Some CSS is going to overwrite other CSS, and that's just how CSS works. So dealing with specificity is important. So if you're ever adding, let's say, a border from that last lesson and it doesn't work, maybe it's because you have border -0 on that element, and it's saying basically get rid of that border entirely. There's a note in here about conveying meaning to assistive technologies. That's just making it available, and it's a nice little note in here about how to make this a little more available to screen readers and to people who are maybe color deficient. Basically, it's called accessibility, and it just helps you make a website that's accessible to everybody on the internet. Not just people with perfect eyesight, but everybody. So let's take a look at color. Colorize text with color utilities. If you want to colorize links, you can use the link helper class, which you can click on, and let's go take a look at this. Link primary, link secondary, success, danger, warning, info, dark, and light, and it gives you all of these. So we're getting into another recurring pattern here where we have primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, and dark. And we can apply that link styling to a link. Let's go back to colors. And again, that pattern shows up. We have text dash primary to change the text color to blue, or secondary, or success to be green, or text dash danger to be red. We can also add background colors. We'll get into background colors in just a moment. There's also text muted, which is like a light gray. Text black 50. There's all sorts of stuff in here. So always read through the documentation. And the thing is, even if this course wasn't about going through the documentation, there's just no way that I'd be able to make a course for you, or anyone can make a course for you that's going to be engaging at all if I just wrote this code out in front of you. If I wrote this code in front of you, I'd be like, well, text dash primary is blue, text dash success is green, text dash danger is red. That is boring. Instead, we can just visually see all of this in here, and if you wanted to, you can always just add this class to any element on your page as long as you have Bootstrap installed. Now there's a bunch of examples in here, and I would encourage you to read through the examples. So text primary, and it says text primary in here, and this is just a paragraph class, or a paragraph element rather, and it's text primary, it's blue. So you can see that example. Now how do we get black? Let's take a look at black background rather. Let's take a look at text warning. So let's go through the code here. Text warning is going to be yellow text, and it says BG dark. BG stands for background. And all that did was change that background color to be dark. Now let's talk about background colors. Again, there's primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, dark, and white. Oh, and there's also transparent. That's a cool one. And so what this does is it sets the background color. And so you can add this to any element as well. So we see P-3 and margin-2, or margin bottom -2. We'll get into those in just a little bit. We don't know what those are yet, but we will near the end of the utilities section of this module. So let's take a look at BG dark. So BG dark, it's the third one from the bottom, 1, 2, 3, BG dark right there. It has a class on there. We don't know what that is. BG dark, background dark is whatever that background dark is going to be, and it has text white on it. Let's go ahead and modify this. Right click, inspect, BG dark, BG dark, there you are. And let's change that text white to text primary. And you can see that it's blue on black. It's a little bit harder to see, so maybe you don't want to do that. Maybe you want to do, instead of text primary, text warning. And that just shows you right away that the color can change. Now, let's take a look at BG dark without any text color on it at all. By default, well, it looks like it disappeared, but it actually didn't. I can select it. It's just that the text is black and the background is black now. And so if you ever have a black background or a colored background, and you want to change that text color, you just add BG, primary, success, danger, info, light, etc. And you can change that text to be same thing, primary, secondary, danger, info, warning, etc., etc. Now, Bootstrap 5 comes with a nice little gradient feature in here, which is really, really nice. I enjoy this a lot. I really like gradients. I think it adds a nice little pop to your website design. And this one is really easy too, but now we're getting into adding classes. So let's not even take a look at the example code, which surely is below here. That seems to be the pattern in these documentation, or in this documentation. We can right-click, inspect, and we see BG primary, BG gradient, text white. Let's go ahead and change that to BG. Let's change it to secondary, if I can spell that right, BG secondary. Let's get rid of that gradient, and let's keep the text white. So you can see that this is now secondary, it's gray. If I wanted to make that a gradient, I just simply type BG-gradient. And that automatically applies a nice gradient from that BG secondary. So we change that first one to look exactly like that second one. Now I'm going to undo that, change that back to primary. And if we scroll on down, oh, I was wrong. There is no example down there. I thought there was going to be an example like this. Well, this is a good case in point. If there is no documentation for it like this, A, it's either going to be self-documenting, or B, you can always experiment. So let's experiment with BG gradient and BG danger. Right-click, inspect. BG danger changes it to red. So let's just change this over to BG gradient. I'm just going to throw a number 2 on there just because I know BG gradient 2 isn't a real thing. And it gets rid of that gradient for me. You can see it's just flat red. And if I wanted to, I could just put that gradient back, and it changes it to a nice gradiented color from a lighter red to a darker red from top to bottom. Now, what I'd like you to do for this lesson is try to add a gradient to one of these. So come up here, go to background color, and pick any one of these and add a background gradient, and maybe try changing the text color as well. Let's talk about the display property. So first of all, we want to always read the how it works. If there's a how it works or something similar, you always want to read that. Even if it seems boring, it might give you a little bit of insight into how something works. So for instance, let's read this. It changes the value of the display property, so it can be display block, display inline block, display flex, display grid, anything like that, with our responsive display utility classes. So we purposely support only a subset of all possible values for display. That's good to know. That means they're not supporting every single property of display. There's a lot of them. There's a ton of them. But frankly, most of them aren't used, so Bootstrap isn't supporting all of them. They're only going to support the most commonly used ones. Classes can be combined for various effects as you need. Also good to know. We can combine different display, not properties, but classes for various effects. Notation, this is really important to read, and we're going to get into this more and more, and this is a fine place to get into this. So D-value, so D stands for display, dash, and then whatever that value is. And the value is going to be either none, inline block, and it says right here, where value is one of these. So there's actually significantly more values for the display property in regular CSS, but Bootstrap is only supporting a handful of these. Because, honestly, you're not going to use any other ones other than this 99.9% of the time. The other thing to look at here is D breakpoint value. And so, for example, that breakpoint could be small, medium, large, extra large, or extra, extra large. And what this does is this gets into mobile first responsiveness. Now, you should be somewhat familiar with responsive design already in a prior CSS module or a prior CSS course. But what this is going to do is if we wrote D-SM-value, whatever that small breakpoint is going to be for your CSS, I think that's like 576 in Bootstrap 5. From 576 pixels and up, it could be display block. And for medium and up, it could be display flex. And for large and up, it could be display grid or something like that. Now, that's a terrible example. We wouldn't actually do something like that. A real life example would be D, none. So we would just say always display none. So just completely hide the element. And if we wanted to show something only on small devices or larger, so not on mobile, but on a small desktop, maybe like a tablet, we would do d-sm-block. And there's probably an example down here. So for example, we could do d inline. So, this is another good example. Divs are display block by default. So let's go ahead and I'll show you what display block looks like. So if I right click and inspect and I go to here, change us to one of the values up here, what do we have? Block. Let's change this down here to block. This is what a div typically looks like. This is its natural state. So if I go ahead and get rid of block altogether, it doesn't change. But what I can do is I can modify that and I can say, hey, even though divs are block element by default, I can change that to block inline. Or not block inline, but display inline. And that just puts it side by side for us, which is really, really nice. That is a very helpful utility. Likewise, a span is usually display inline like what we see up here, but we can change that behavior with d-block. And that's just going to make it basically act like a div. So a span is now basically a div in this particular example. Let's talk about hiding elements. This gets really, really useful. This is the responsiveness I was talking about. So Bootstrap is mobile first. That means you're going to apply a class to make it look good on mobile, and then you're going to add a modifier for a small or an extra small device, a small device, a medium device, large device, extra large device, and an extra extra large device. So you could hide something completely with just d none. If you want to hide something only on extra small, you'd say hide it by default, and then small and up, so it's going to hide it on extra small devices. So small and up, it's going to be display block. Or if you wanted to hide it on extra large, you would do display extra large none, and that's just going to hide it on extra large devices, but it's going to show it on every other device. Now, is there a good example? There's not a good example in here, so maybe this is something that you're going to want to experiment with. In fact, this is going to be something you want to experiment with. What I would suggest is either going to codepen.io or starting a new project and just playing with these, because these are really, really important. Now, if you ever want to get into responsive testing, you can always do a right click, inspect, and I'm just on Chrome and there's this little icon here. It's a little bit different on Mozilla. Firefox, on Firefox I believe it's in the right, but essentially there's this toggle device toolbar. And if I click that, what I can do is I can make my page look bigger and smaller. And you see how, watch this column over here, it's going to collapse and it goes away. See that? That is responsive design. And largely this is working with the display property. And if I want to toggle this off, I can just do this. Now, a lot of people, what they like to do is they just like to change their entire screen size. That works too, but this is a little more accurate. So if you can, use this little tool in here. And again, how I got there, right click, inspect, click this little device, toggle device toolbar, and then you can just resize. And you can change that size to be something very specific if you wanted to. Now let's go back down to where we were. Now, what is small, medium, large, and extra, extra large? Let's go into layout quickly. And let's go into breakpoints. And so that's what those are called. Those are called breakpoints. And the available breakpoints. So extra small is anything less than 576 pixels. Small is larger than 576. Medium is 768 or larger, and so on and so on. Extra large is 1400 pixels or wider. So if I right click, inspect, toggle, I can change this to be like 1400, and I change that up here. I can change that to be like 1400, or I can just hit down and it'll just keep getting smaller and smaller. As you can see, this is very, very slowly getting smaller and smaller. Or I can just type in a number like 576. And what's another one? What? I think it was 768. There we go. So 768. And if I click down, go to 767, it snaps. The page changes just like that. And so that's what a breakpoint is. That's really, really important to know. Now let's go back to utilities and display. What else do we have to talk about in our display? Display in print. So if you're ever making a page and you want it to be printable, you're going to want to deal with print. So display print none. When someone is going to print the page, so they hit like Control P or Command P and you try to print that page, what's it going to look like? This is what the print looks like when we try to print this particular page. Now, this is pretty cool. It hid this column on the left. It hid the column on the right as well. And what else did it do? You can see that this table here is smaller. And that's about it. Even the footer is changed and the header is different as well. And so that's what print does. So if you want to hide something when someone is printing, like this column or this right column, you do dprint none or dprint inline. So when someone is printing the page, do you want an element to be inline or inline block or grid or table row, etc., etc. So for this, there is no official task. What I would like you to do though is I would like you to just experiment with it. Try creating a div that's only visible on medium display. Now, this is going to be a little bit tricky. This is going to make your brain sweat. So you're going to want to use dnone. And then if we go to visible, we're going to want to do something like this. So dnone, d small block. So this is visible only on small devices. And then basically what this is saying is hide it by default. Small and up, make it a block element. Medium and up, make it hidden again. So go ahead and try that one out. All right, at this point in time in your learning journey, you should be familiar with Flex and Grid at least a little bit. If you're not, at least Bootstrap is going to make this really, really easy for you. So Flex is a display property. And let's go down here and let's just take a look at some of these examples. So this is a Flexbox container, and how we add Flex is d-flex, and that just makes this a Flexbox container. There's two other classes in here that we aren't familiar with yet, so let's just go ahead and ignore those. But what this does is it makes it a Flexbox container, and it looks like it did absolutely nothing. And if we wanted an inline Flexbox container, we could do d-inline flex, and that again just applies Flexbox, but it's inline. So instead of taking up all the width as a regular flex or block element would, it takes up the least amount of space like a regular inline block or a regular inline element would. It also just applies flex to it as well. Now there's responsive variations for flex. So for instance, if we wanted something to be a flexbox, if we wanted an element to be flexbox 100% of the time, we would just type dflex. But if we wanted something to be a flexbox, if we wanted, let's say, an H1 element to be flex only on large devices and up, we would type d-lg for large-flex. And that means it's going to be probably, if it was an H1 or a div, it's going to be a block element, so it's going to be d-block by default, but on large and up, it's going to be a flexbox. Now we can change the direction as well, which is pretty cool here. So let's just dive right into this code. Div class dflex. So we know that this example up here is a flexbox. It's saying it's a flex row. And so every item in here is going to go into this particular row. Now, if we wanted to make this a reversed row, what we could do is type dflex and then flex row reverse, and that's just going to reverse it for us. So it goes 3, 2, 1 at the bottom and 1, 2, 3 at the top. It also changes from hugging the left side to hugging the right side. So that's just changing the direction in there. We can also change this to column. So if we wanted all of our divs to be columns instead of rows, so they sit underneath each other instead of beside each other, we could simply type dflex and then flex column. Or if we wanted to reverse it, we could do dflex and flex column reverse. And again, that goes 1, 2, 3, up and down, and then 3, 2, 1, again, up and down instead of left to right or right to left. And there's a lot of responsive variations in here as well. So we can do flex small and up, it's going to be a row. Maybe it's going to be flex column by default, but small and up is going to be a row. So on mobile devices, we can make it look like this. And on desktop, we can make it look like this. So that's what the responsive variations are in Bootstrap. It's really, really important that we know how to use these as well. And there's quite a few of them, but it all follows a pattern. So you notice that it's just flex row 100% of the time. Small and up, it could be a row. Small and up, it could be a row reverse. Small and up, it could be a column. Small and up, it could be column reverse. Medium and up, large and up, extra large and up, extra, extra large and up. Now there's a lot to go through here, so what I'm going to do is power through this just a little bit, and I would encourage you to take a look at the docs and just try these out on your own. This is really, really important. And again, you can always right-click, inspect, and you can change this. So if I make this just a tad taller, where it says deflex, let's go ahead and get rid of flex and content, justify content start. Let's go ahead and get rid of that. And that's what it looks like by default. This is regular HTML, regular CSS. And if we just apply that flex, it changes it back to here. So I'm just toggling this on and off. Now, justifying content is very, very useful in the world of CSS and making a beautiful website. So you want to maybe apply flexbox, but you want everything to hug the right. You would justify that content to the end. If you want it to hug the left, you would justify that content to the start. So the start being the left and the end being the right. If you wanted to, you could justify all of it in the center. We see that here. Justify content center. We can add spacing so that if there were only 3 items, there would be 1 on the left, 1 in the middle, 1 on the right, and that uses content between, justify content between. We can also have spacing on either the left and the right, and between all of these elements so that it's not hugging the far right or the far left. And that just adds a little bit of spacing in there. You may not want to do that, but if you do want to do that, that's justify content around. And lastly, the one that you'll probably end up using more often than not is going to be justify content evenly. And that just adds this even block here, another exactly spaced out block here, 1 here, and 1 here. And so this, and this, and this section, and this section are all the exact same width. Now again, there's responsive variations, and this is really getting into a very tedious pattern here, and I think you're starting to get the point. So if we wanted to justify all of our content on, let's say we wanted to justify all of our content to be in the center on a desktop, but on mobile, maybe we want it to hug the left. What we would do is we would go down here and we say justify content center, but we want it to be just small devices and up. So we would say justify content, look down here, SM center. So small devices 560 pixels or wider is going to be centered. And then we would say also justify content start. So anything under that is going to be justify content start. And that just means on mobile devices, it hugs the left. On non-mobile devices, it hugs, doesn't hug, but it floats in the center. And that is a powerful thing in Flexbox. We can also align individual items or rows. And what I'm going to do is just sort of speed up this process in this particular video, because this is going to get really, really tedious. And again, I'd highly encourage you to take a look at the docs and just read through them. And I cannot stress enough that being able to read through the documentation is a very, very, very important skill for all web developers. You need to be able to read through the documentation and understand what's going on. Now, sometimes documentation is going to be, there's just no polite way of putting this, it's going to be terrible. And if the documentation is terrible, there's just no way around that other than experimenting on your own. But for the most part, if you're going to be using something like Bootstrap, which is wildly popular, the documentation is going to be really good. The documentation for Tailwind as well, Tailwind CSS, also very, very good. So here we can see different examples, and we can see that, let's look at this middle one here, where there's spacing at the top and the bottom. Let's go down here and take a look at this middle example, and it's saying deflex, we're familiar with that, align items center. So that's just going to fix it to be in the center. Or if we wanted all the items to be the exact same height, we would say align item stretch. And what I did there was I took these 5 examples, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and down here there's 5 pieces of code, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And so if I want the 5th one, I just look at the 5th. Or if I want to look at the 5th example, I just look at the 5th piece of code in here. And that's a nice pattern that Bootstrap does with their docs. Not all docs do that, but the Bootstrap docs are really, really good that way. There's responsive variations, we're familiar with that. We can align self, so we can do all sorts of different things. So if we wanted to align just one particular item, but stretch the other ones, let's take a look at that 3rd example. There's 5 here, so I'm looking at the 3rd one right in the middle. There's 5 here, looking at the 3rd one right in the middle. This is align self-center. Now this is a little less explanatory. So let's right click, inspect it, and let's take a look at what we're doing here. Deflex, the first one is a regular flex item. The second one is saying align self-center, and actually this turned out to be a pretty good example. I thought this was going to have something else on it, but it doesn't. And the second one is, the third one is basically the same as the first one. And so the only one we changed there was the middle one. And we changed that to align self-center. Now the thing about this is we have deflex on the parent element. So we have a div as the parent, and as the child element, the middle one here, it's align self-center. So align self-center is only going to work with deflex. And again, we can see that we know that because it's in the Bootstrap docs under flex. Now, if you try to do this without using Flexbox, this simply is not going to work for you. To get things vertically aligned, you need to be using Flexbox. Let's take a look at another example. There's fill. I'm going to let you read through that on your own. There's grow and shrink. Again, just regular Flexbox properties. So if you want it to be able to grow, great. If you want it to be able to grow and shrink, you could say Flexbox shrink is equal to 1. So this item is allowed to shrink. This one up here is allowed to grow. And where I got that from was FlexGrow1 that says this item here is allowed to, let's say, by default, this takes up 3 individual pieces and they're all the exact same width. This one is allowed to grow, and the other 2 are going to shrink to be their minimum widths. Flex shrink is the exact opposite. So what else do we have in here? We've got auto margins, which is really, really important if you ever want like one item on the left and a couple items on the right, or vice versa. Width align items, do we have anything? This is a good one. Flexbox by default is going to wrap all their items like this. So if you have too many items, it's going to go onto a new row by itself. And this is not the case with regular Flexbox, just using regular CSS. This is the case using Bootstrap. And so when you use Bootstrap, you want to use deflex and then flex no wrap. And what that's going to do is, even if this box here is only, let's say, like 8 rems wide, it's going to keep going to the left. So if you wanted to create some sort of page where you needed to scroll left to right, you would use flex no wrap, and that could allow the page, or the flex items at least, to extend outside of its parent element. By default, flex wrap is on. We can also reverse the items if we wanted to. Again, this is just getting into regular Flexbox stuff, but we're just writing shortcuts here. So instead of writing display flex on every single CSS element, we can just write the class deflex. There's different ordering. This is kind of cool. Not really all that important, I find, but occasionally you do want to reorder things. And so this says third, second, and first flex item, even though in our code we wrote first, second, and third in order. So it's 1, 2, 3 in our code, and it's 3, 2, 1 the way it displays. And all we did there was we changed the order. So order 3, order 2, order 1. And that goes all the way up to order 5. So 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can change those orderings. Now let's go ahead and do an example here. Let's right click and inspect. And order 2, let's change this to order 5. And you can see that that changed it. So we have order 1, it's the first one. We have order 3, it's the next one in line. It doesn't have to be order 2, it's just the next one in line. And so this is order 3, so that goes in the middle. And then order 5 goes at the very end. If we wanted to change this back, we could change this to order 2 and put 2 in there. Or if we wanted to put this back to normal, we could say order 1 for flex first item. Order 2, that's already set. And then order 3, and this puts it back into regular ordering, which sort of defeats the purpose of being able to order anyways, but if you ever wanted to, you could do that. And the important thing here to note is the responsiveness. So we have responsive variations. And this is where you're going to use ordering. Is, let's say you have 3 blocks side by side on desktop, but on mobile, let's say you have an image in there and it's not big enough to see 3 of them side by side. So your device isn't wide enough. On mobile, what you can do is you can change that to be, instead of deflex row, which is what it is, you can change this to deflex column, and then you can change the ordering. So if you wanted that last one to always be on top, because maybe you have a sponsorship item on the right and it should catch people's eye, but on mobile it should be at the very top, you could change that ordering to 1. And what you do here is you would say this item would be at the very end by default. So you could say order 5. And then, actually I got that backwards. You would say order 0, so it would be the very first one. And then on small and up, you would say order SM5, and that would push it to the right. Go ahead and give that a try as well. Try out all these different things that I'm explaining to you. It's really, really good experience, and each one of these really is only going to take a minute or two to practice. There's a way to align content and all sorts of stuff in here. I think you are really getting the point that Flexbox is A, a really big CSS module, and B, with Bootstrap is very, very powerful. So what I would like you to do as your task for this lesson is to just experiment with each one of these. I want you to try to recreate these on your own. Don't just copy and paste. Don't copy and paste. I want you to actually write these out. There's something special about being able to write it out versus just copying and pasting. Copying and pasting, you're not going to learn. All you're going to learn is that the example exists in Bootstrap documentation, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but if you want the actual experience, if you want to be able to put on your resume or your CV that you know Bootstrap, you're going to want to write this out and turn that copy and paste mode into an actual experience so that you know when you're writing some code, if some designer gives you a design, you can just start writing this. You don't have to go to the documentation every single time, click copy, and then modify it. You can just start writing it. So please write these examples out by hand, well, on your keyboard, of course, and do these examples the long way. Let's take a look at float. So with Flexbox, floating is really not all that useful, but there is a point in time where you want to use float. And I think there's an example on here where we use float. Is there? No, not really. Maybe let's go into layout. There's an example kicking around here somewhere. Anyways, it's in here. And the idea is that you could have like this giant paragraph like this, and you can have an image just sort of like floating to the left or floating to the right with your text wrapping around it. Now you often see these in articles on, let's say, like medium.com or a blog post where someone has a bunch of text and you've got like an image sort of stuck in that text and there's text moving all around it. That's where you would use float. Now, floating really only has 3 options in Bootstrap. You can float start, that's at the very beginning, that's going to float it to the left. You can float end, that's going to float it to the right. Or you can say don't float at all, which is the default. Nothing in CSS floats on its own until you tell it to float. There's also responsiveness in here, so if you wanted an image to float to the right on small devices and up, you would say float SM end. And then let's say on mobile devices, so 576 pixels, if I remember that correctly, and under, you would say float none. And that's just going to make an image appear as big as it possibly can on small devices. And then on small and up, or medium and up, or large and up, or extra large and up, you could say that image needs to float. Now this is actually sort of a bad example, but what I'd like you to do is, you know what? Nothing. I don't want you to do anything in this one. Just know that there's only 3 examples here. Float start, float end, and float none. Interactions are a fun thing, and if I recall correctly, this is a new thing in Bootstrap 5, and this is pretty cool. What I really, really like about this is, first of all, text selection. Change the way in which the content is selected when the user interacts with it. So this first one says, this paragraph will be entirely selected when clicked by the user. So I haven't clicked yet, but if I click it, it selects the whole thing. Now this is really good for services where like you want someone to be able to copy and paste an entire selection. All they have to do is click in one place and it selects the whole thing. You'll see this with APIs and API keys. So if you ever sign up for a service like Stripe, for instance, or Amazon Web Services, they're going to give you API keys and you want to be able to select all of it. So instead of being able to like click and select each character one by one, you can just click and it selects the whole thing for you. And that uses user select all. This paragraph is default, so nothing special about that. But if you ever needed to overwrite that, you could overwrite that. And this one here is not even selectable at all. I can't even select that. And you'll see that on some websites. Personally, I prefer if people don't do that. It's really, really irritating, but sometimes there's a place and time. There's a good reason to not be able to select text. Now, that's not going to stop anyone from doing anything. You can always just right click and you can see user select none. I can literally just delete that class and select it. But for a non-tech person, a non-web developer, they might not know how to do that. And so you can sort of prevent people from copying and pasting certain text by using that. Now, again, I prefer to not use that and let people just have a default experience, because maybe someone doesn't know what a certain word is and they want to be able to select it on their phone and look it up, copy and paste it into Google or a dictionary of some kind. And they're not able to do that if you use user select none. Now there's these things called pointer events. Pointer events, these are pretty cool, and this is prefixed with PE, so PE none, PE auto. So this is a link right here, and we can see it here. It's in a paragraph. There's a link with PE none on it. I cannot click this. I can click all the other text, but I cannot click this link. It makes it basically unclickable. This is a normal one, default behavior. You can see my mouse actually changes when I just move over that. I'll zoom in so you can see this. And the default one does nothing. Now, whenever you see a block like this, where it's got like a little color on the side, or maybe it's a different color in the documentation, basically this is saying, hey, just so you know, there's some sort of warning here. And I'm going to let you read that on your own, but always read the warnings if there are any in the documentation. And again, this is a module on both Bootstrap and reading documentation. Okay, Overflow has these nice little shorthand utilities for quickly configuring how content overflows an element. And again, the best way to really experience this is just to see the docs. And so if you want content like this, it's the first item in here. So you'd use Overflow Auto. If you want your content not scrollable and to be sort of clipped, to be hidden, you would use Overflow Hidden. And if you have, let's say, a parent element and you want that content to flow this way, which honestly I don't think you ever would, but if you ever find yourself in need of that, you can use Overflow Visible. And lastly, if you ever wanted to scroll left and right, this is not a very good example, but it does provide a scroll bar in there so people can scroll left and right, up and down. Typically the one you're going to end up using is Overflow Auto, and that just allows it to scroll up and down. Now there's nothing major about this one, so what I would like you to do is create a couple different examples if you can. And if you ever need help setting up an example, just right click inspect, and you can see, first of all, this is a flex. So display, medium devices, and larger, use flex. Its first element is Overflow Auto. It has some padding, margin, background of light. So you can change that BG to be BG light and set a max width and a max height on that as well. And then just write a bunch of content in there. And then as long as you have Overflow Auto, you should see this. Go ahead and give that a shot, and when you're ready, let's head on over to the next lesson, which is going to be a slightly longer one on positioning. Positioning is really, really important in the world of CSS, and Bootstrap makes it really easy for us. So we use position static, and I think in Bootstrap 3 or Bootstrap 4, I can't recall, it was just POS dash static, and now it's position static. So all elements by default are static, but you can say position relative, position absolute, position fixed, and position sticky. Now, these are all really important to know, and a new one, a new-ish one anyways, in CSS is sticky. So you see how I scroll down the page and we have this navigation up here, and it just stays with me the whole time. That is sticky. That means it's going to stick with me, but if I scroll up, you can see that it has that nice little smooth line where I can scroll down behind this nav bar, and as I scroll, it becomes sticky with my page. That's an important one to note. Arranging elements, okay. Where property is one of, top, start, bottom, or end. Let's take a look at this. And position can be either 0, 50, or 100%. So this is pretty fun. And what I would like you to do here is, in this video, for this example, what I want you to do is just come to this page and tinker around with this. So first of all, position absolute always needs to have a position relative parent. 100% of the time, that's just a CSS rule, not a Bootstrap rule. So this first one here is saying position absolute. This is all relative. This whole thing is relative. So position absolute, top 0, so it's going to hug up here. Start 0, so it's going to be on the left. This one up here is going to be top 0, end 0. This one is going to be bottom 0, end 0. Now these middle ones, I can just right click and inspect. And you can see that it's position absolute, bottom 50%, so from the bottom 50%, moves up, and which one are we looking at here? So it moves up 50%, and it moves from the right 50%. This one goes from the top 50% and then from the left 50%. And that's top 50 and start 50. So remember when I said way early on that start is either the top or the left and end is either the right or the bottom? This applies here. Start is the left, end is the right. So we're saying move from the right 50% inwards. This one here, we're saying start from the left, move 50% inwards, and that's called start 50. So it starts on the left, goes 50% inwards, and then you have your element. Now, what if you want to position these like perfectly centered? Because these aren't perfectly centered. What we can do here is we can use translate middle. And this is really useful when you're writing code and something needs to be perfectly centered. Now, you're probably not going to use these ones that are on the edge, so we're not going to go over those, but the one on the middle, you're going to see this a lot, and you're going to want to do this. So the whole thing is position relative, this whole block here, and this middle one here is going to be, if we just read through this, position absolute, top 50, so it's moving from the top down 50, start 0, nope, that's the wrong one, start 50, so that's going to come from the left, 50% inwards, translate middle, and that's just going to bump it back in 50%. So let's go ahead and experiment with this. Let's right click, position absolute, top 50, start 50, translate middle. If we get rid of translate middle, and what I'm going to do here is I'm just going to add a bunch of 2's at the end here because translate dash middle 22222 is not a class in Bootstrap. This is where it would sit by default. That's what we saw in the first lesson. If I just scroll on up here, this is what we saw. There's no translate middle in here. And so if you're ever trying to position something perfectly in the middle and you're like, well, how do I get this perfectly centered? You can do like a negative margin, or you could do like an overwrite. You could say top 47.5%, but that's no way to live your life. A better way is say top 50%, left 50%, and then translate that into the middle. So let's go ahead and set this back. Let's get rid of those 2's, and it puts it back in the middle for us. And so essentially, what we see here, this is the default. This is what CSS is going to do by default. So it says top 50%, left 50%, and that works with this little corner here, right there. That's kind of hard to see. I'll zoom in here. It just works with this tiny little corner in there. What translate middle does is says, well, that corner is supposed to be like right in here, coming downwards like this, but instead it's going to bump that left 50% of the element width and up 50% of the element height and perfectly center it. You're going to want to get some hands-on experience with this one. Go ahead and give that a shot as well. Make that your task for this particular lesson, and when you're ready, let's move on to the next lesson. Okie dokie, let's talk about shadows. So occasionally you want to add shadows to things just to make them pop a little bit on your screen. So we can see down here there's absolutely no shadow. This one has a little bit of a shadow, so it actually pops out a little bit more. It looks like it's coming off of your screen a little bit. This one looks like it's really coming off of your screen, and this one looks like it's really coming off of your screen. And these are just different shadows. So all it does is add this little shadow down here. And we can see that first one is shadow none. Second one is shadow small. The third one is a regular shadow, just regular shadow, right here. And the last one is a large shadow. So we do shadow dash LG. This is really good for making cards. And a card is a component. So let's go into components. Let's go into card. We're not going to cover cards in this module or components in this module just because it's made up of all these different utilities and all this different stuff. You can make all of this by the end of this course on your own. But these come with some nice little examples here. So is there one with a shadow? Shadow. There isn't. So let's go ahead and add a shadow. What I'm going to do is, boom, right click, inspect. Find this entire card. So I got a card in here. And I don't want the image, I want the whole card. So let's do shadow. And all I did was add that shadow in there. Watch this, if I get rid of shadow, or if I add shadow, just looks like it's coming off of the page a little bit, which is really cool. I really like shadows. And in modern designs, you'll see shadows quite a bit. So let's go back to utilities and go into shadows. And what I would like you to do is just create a div and add a different type of shadow on it. That's going to be your task for this lesson. When you're done playing around with shadows and and you've had some fun with that, let's head on over to the next lesson where we talk about sizing. Easily make an element as wide or as tall with our width and height utilities. Okay, so this is getting into sizing. So we can see here width 25, 50, 75, 100%, and auto. And all we do is add W25, W50, W75, W100. And just like that, in less than, what was that, 45 seconds, you now know how to add widths to an element. And so this is a div, and it's saying that the width is only going to be 25%. These are all divs, in fact. This one here is only going to be 75%. Now, height is a little bit different. So you can't just say height 75 and hope that it's going to be 75%. What you need here is a parent element with an exact height set. So if you have a parent element with a height of 100 pixels, and this has just a background color, some ugly background color in there, you can say height 25, height 50, height 75, height 100, or height auto. Height auto is what you're going to normally deal with. Height 25% doesn't look like it's really doing a whole lot unless we change this height. So let's go ahead and do that. Let's experiment here. Right click, inspect. And let's go height. Let's change this to 250 pixels. There we go. This looks a little bit better. And you can see that height is 25%. So 4 of these is going to add up to height 100%. Height auto does nothing. That's just a CSS quirk from the days of yore. Old CSS. I'm saying old with an E. Old DE. Old CSS. But height 25% is nice because you can just make it 25% of its parent height with H-25. Now you may need to add inline block because if you're working with an element that's just inline, inline elements don't have a height. So let's do D inline. And you see it goes back to normal. There's nothing fancy about it. There's no width, nothing like that. It's just inline. You have to add inline block or display block or something along those lines in order to actually give it some sort of height. So the example here is really, really clear. It says H25 D inline block. This has a default width as well and a bunch of background color. It's just styling, regular styling, just as an example here. Now you can also use max width 100%, max width or max height 100% utilities as needed as well with MW, max width or max height. And what this is going to say is the max height is 100%. All right, last but not least, and this is more modern CSS, we can do a height or a width based on the viewport. So the viewport is like this whole white section that you see here. This is my editor, not the URL part up here, not my extensions or plugins or anything like that. It's just the part of the page that you actually see. That is your viewport. Now this doesn't have an example, so maybe this would be a fun example for you to try out. Try setting a viewport width of 100. And what you could do here is you could right click, inspect, and well, you probably don't want to inspect it right on that element in there. Let's try something like this. There we go. This has a max height of 100. You can say the viewport width is going to be 100%. It's the same as saying width 100%. But in CSS land, you can also say width is equal to what percent of the viewport. So we could say like 10 VW. And you can see that that actually gets wider. And this is relative to my viewport, not the parent element, but the viewport. So this is 32% of my viewport. This is roughly 1/3 of my entire screen real estate in here. That's what the viewport is relative to the viewport, not your parent element, but to the viewport. And there's a case and time and place for viewport width and heights. I can't think of one off the top of my head just because I haven't worked with a design that needed it for a little while, but there is a place and time for that. So maybe just tuck this in your back pocket for later. All right, let's talk about margin and padding. This is a hugely important feature, a utility in Bootstrap. All the Bootstraps, actually. This has been a huge feature in all the Bootstraps. So first of all, you need to know the difference between margin and padding. Margin is the space between, let's say, this element up here, it's a paragraph, I think, and this one down here. So that space in there is margin. The space between the inside here and this text is padding. So margin is the outside spacing, padding is the inside spacing. And let's look at the notation quickly. So where the property is one of either margin, M for margin, or P for padding. And we've seen this before, like MB2, margin bottom 2. And so that's where it gets into sides. T for top, B for bottom, and you can mix and match these. So it can be like MB, margin bottom, or PT for padding top. S for class is to set the left margin or the left padding on LTR, or the opposite on right to left. That's really important to note. E is the same way. It's just margin right or padding right, but it's going to be left and left for right to left pages. So if you write in Arabic, for instance, I think Arabic is one of those languages that's right to left. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Don't quote me on that. I actually don't know. But if you are writing in a language that's right to left, you could use, let's say, margin S, so MS, and that's going to change the margin right or the padding right. Then we have different sizes, and we can mix and match these as well. So we have 0 through 5 and auto. So let's take a look at some examples here. MX auto. We skipped one. Did we skip one in here? Oh, we did. We skipped a couple of them. Let's go back. So X is on the X-axis. So if you have a graph, X-axis is your left and right. And same thing with Y, but sort of different. So same but different. But Y is your top and bottom. So it's your Y-axis. X-axis, Y-axis. Think of it like a graph. So if we go down to this example here, we have MX auto, and that's just going to center this right in the middle. If we wanted to, we could right click and inspect, and let's have some fun with this. Let's do margin top 5. And you can see that adds margin top. We can also add padding, let's say padding 3, and that's just going to add some spacing on the inside. If we wanted to make this margin top and bottom of 5, so we could do margin top 5, margin bottom dash 5. You can see that that added some spacing down here. There's a shortcut though. So if we wanted to apply the same on the top and bottom, we'd say margin Y, that's the Y axis, top and bottom, dash 5, MY dash 5. And you see it doesn't change anything there. It's the exact same as what I originally wrote. It's just using the Y axis, so it's top and bottom. Now Bootstrap does allow you to use negative margins. You do have to set this in your customized settings, which we haven't really gone into at all. We did talk about customization at the beginning of this course, but if you wanted to, you could go ahead and set that. We don't deal with negative margins in Bootstrap. However, if you're using something like Tailwind CSS, it does do negative margins by default. Let's also talk about gaps. So here we have a grid, so display grid, and this gap is going to be 3, and that gap is going to be on the left and right, top and bottom. And so if we go ahead and just right click and inspect, we can have some fun with this. We can see what this does. So dgrid gap 3, and we know it goes from 1 to 5. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Let's change this to 1. And you can see that that gap between each column in here gets just a little bit smaller. We could also change that to 5 to be the widest gap, and it gets to be really, really wide. And that's just using grids. So we have that gap modifier in there. One thing to note though, is there is no gap auto utility class. And that's because it's basically the same thing as gap 0. What I would like you to do is play around with margin and spacing. So where is, oh, I scrolled right past it. Create an element, give it a margin, and give it a padding, and try different margins and paddings. Now you can also mix and match these with responsive utilities. So you could say margin, so M, that's this one here, I selected 2 lines, I meant to select 1, margin bottom of 3, but you can also say margin bottom dash SM dash 3. So that's small devices and up, or large devices and up, or extra large devices and up is going to have a margin bottom of 3, and anything smaller than that is not going to have that margin. So you can mix and match responsive variations as well. So you have margin, padding, top, bottom, left or right. Again, left or right, depending on your RTL settings. Left and right, top and bottom. And then you have these different sizes. And then you have small, medium, large, and extra, extra large. And it doesn't mention anything about that in there. So maybe these docs are a little bit incomplete at this time, but that will work for you. And we've actually seen this in a previous video. I kept saying, oh, we don't know what MB2 is. That's margin bottom 2. So go ahead and give that a shot, and when you are ready, let's head on over to that next lesson where we talk about text. Alrighty, let's talk about vertical alignment. So vertical alignment has a good example right here. So you can use it with table cells. We're going to skip that because a lot of places just aren't using tables these days. If you are using a table, definitely reference the documentation with a table here. But for the most part, you're going to see this. So there's a line baseline. This is your baseline. So there's like this line, this invisible line that goes right through all of your text. And you can sort of picture it just underneath here where my cursor is. Oop, if I can keep it just underneath that text, there's like this invisible line there. And so baseline is going to basically be on your baseline. You can move that text up with a line top. You can middle it. You can do align text bottom, align text top, and you can see that these aren't super intuitive. So if you ever have to, change the alignment of your text, I honestly just recommend coming to vertical align and not committing this to memory because you're not going to use this too often. But it is a utility that is available to you in Bootstrap. So there's no task for this lesson. All I wanted to do was show you that vertical alignment with your text line is completely possible. Let's take a look at the last utility in Bootstrap 5 called visibility. Now there's actually pretty much no documentations here, but what we can do is our own little example here. So it says we can apply visible or invisible as needed. So let's go ahead and let's take this text here, visibility, and let's add a class called invisible. Invisible, it has to be a space though. INVISIBIL. That is not how you spell it. Okay, so it made it invisible. I can't select it, but it didn't hide it entirely. So unlike display none, so if we do D none, you can see that it actually moves the element. Like it's literally not visible on your page. Invisible will just make it invisible. It still takes up the same space, it's just invisible. Think of like a superhero with the power of invisibility. They still take up physical space. They still have a physical presence. You just can't see them. That's what visible does, or invisible does. Visible is when you have an element that's, let's say, invisible, an invisible person. You can go ahead and make them visible again. So let's see what happens if I type invisible and visible. Which one is going to be? Oh, invisible takes precedence over visible. So let's go ahead and just get rid of invisible. It shows up again. As normal, most things are visible by default. So really the only one you're going to use here for the most part is going to be invisible. Now, if you ever wanted to work with like fading something in and out, you probably wouldn't use visible or invisible. Instead, what you would do is you would set the opacity to 0, and then when it like scrolls into view like this, you could animate that into opacity 100%. So you wouldn't use visibility or invisibility for that. Now, frankly, I haven't actually used visibility or invisibility too often in my career as a developer. For the most part, you're going to be using opacity instead, or display none, or something like that. But if you ever need to make something visible or invisible, again, with Bootstrap 5, that is completely possible. Now, there's no task for this lesson. I just wanted to show you that this is the last one in the utilities section before we move on to layout. Welcome to breakpoints. So breakpoints are triggers in Bootstrap for how your layout responsively changes across all devices or viewport sizes. And so behind the scenes, it's going to be using a media query using regular CSS. And at this point in time, you should be familiar with media queries. We covered it in CSS 301 if you watched that module or took that course. So in Bootstrap by default, there are different breakpoints. We touched on this about an hour ago, I think, where extra small devices are considered to be 576 pixels or smaller. Actually, I lied. It's less than 576. So it's not equal to, it's less than 576. So it's 575 and lower. Small is anything bigger than that, up to the medium point where it's 768, up to the large point where it's 992, up to the extra large point where it's 1200, up to the extra large point where it's 1400 pixels or taller. Now you can mix and match these with pretty much everything. And we've gotten into different responsive variations already, which is why we went and learned the utilities first, because learning the utilities was a little bit easier than learning the breakpoints at first. If I just said these are breakpoints, you might be like, well, I don't really know what that is, which is why we learned the responsive stuff first. So there's customization in here. Oh, media queries, there's mention of media queries, that's good news. If you wanted to write your own Sass, you could just write include media breakpoint up, yada yada. And that gets compiled down to CSS that looks like this. So this is what we're looking at here. So anything that's small, a small device, is going to have a minimum width of 576. And so that 576 is coming from here. So small and up is 576. Medium devices, such as tablets, are 768 and up. So it's got a min width, not a max width, a min width. So this is saying 576 and up, 768 and up, 992 and up, 1200 and up, 1400 and up. And so when we're dealing with Bootstrap, we're always talking about mobile first. So we want to make things look good on our cell phones, and then we want to make things look good on a tablet, and then make things look good on a desktop, and then make things look good on a TV, etc., etc., etc. We always go from the smallest to the biggest. And a lot of this stuff is Sass. So a way to compile our CSS, which we're not going to get into at this point in time. In the next lesson, let's go ahead and cover containers. This is vital when you're using Bootstrap. So there's no task. Maybe there's a task. Read through breakpoints real quick. And when you're done reading through that, it should probably take you about 3 minutes. Head on over to the next lesson where we talk about containers. Okay, text is really, really important. The internet is based on three things. Images, which sometimes have text in them, which we can't control with HTML or CSS. Videos, same thing, we can't control that. And regular text, what we read here. And the internet is largely made up of words, or web pages are largely made up of words. And so we want to be able to read and change how we read things. And so there's this thing called text alignment. Now in Bootstrap 4, I believe this was called text left. In Bootstrap 5, it's called text start. And so this just aligns everything to the left. This is text center, we can see that in here. And this is, again, following this pattern of start, center, and end. And so this one here is end align text on all viewport sizes. And so this is just text end. Now we can mix and match text start, center, and end with different responsive variations. So we can do text small and up is going to be left. Or this bottom one is going to be text large and up is going to be on the left. So it's going to be starting on the left. As a good example, let's go ahead and right click on this, inspect, and let's change this to be text end. And so it looks like it did nothing, but if we change this, and you know, maybe let's just change the text in here too. This is Caleb's text. Let's go ahead and toggle on that device toolbar, and let's go on down. This is Caleb's text. This is Caleb's text. It's on the right, but if I make this bigger, you'll see eventually, where is it? It snapped, so it hid. There it is. It's still on the right. And I said on text, extra large screens and larger, it's going to be on the left, just like that. It's now snapping. So it's saying all the time, it's going to be on the right, except for extra large screens and larger, which is somewhere around 1200 pixels. Okay, let's just clean that up and get rid of that. There's also text wrapping. So this text should wrap if you have like a nice little badge. This is a nice little component called a badge. Maybe you don't want your text to go all the way to the side. And let's go ahead and maybe just disable text wrap and let's see what happens here. Maybe nothing, maybe something. Let's go ahead and grab that text wrap class, delete it. This is what it looks like by default. This text should wrap. It has a width, and you can actually see that this text is sticking out of that element. Maybe we don't want that. Maybe we want that text to always be inside of this particular badge, this element. And so we say text wrap. And what that's going to do is wrap that text onto a new line. There's also no wrap. So if for some reason you wanted this to happen, I can't actually think of any point in time where I ever wanted this to happen. But if you ever run into this, then Maybe you want to add text no wrap. There's also word breaking. Word breaking is really, really nice. It prevents long strings of text from breaking your component's layout by using text-break. So let's go ahead and right click on this, inspect, and see what this looks like without text breaks. Let's do text break 22222. This is what it looks like by default. Look at that, that is long. It actually breaks our page. It makes us scroll left and right, and we shouldn't be able to do that on this page. So let's undo that, and you can see that it breaks your word into multiple lines in case you have a really, really long word. There's also a note in here. Breaking words isn't possible in Arabic, which is the most used RTL language. Oh, I was right before. I said I wasn't sure, but it was. Arabic is a right to left language. And therefore, text break is removed from RTL compiled CSS because it simply doesn't work. So it's always good to read these little things in documentation because I actually didn't know that until just now. There's also text transform. So if you're writing code with a front end and a back end language, like maybe you're writing Django, so it's using Python, and all the text comes back as lowercase and you want it to all be uppercase, you could do text-uppercase. And text-uppercase simply makes it uppercase. Now you don't have a back-end language processing that, which means your site will be 0.0000001% faster because it doesn't have to process that. You can make the user process that by using CSS. Likewise, we have text lowercase and text capitalize. Text capitalize, this is a terrible example here. Let's go ahead and right-click, inspect, and capitalize text. Let's go ahead and make this a lowercase c. And it doesn't change anything in here. We could say all lowercase, and it makes that first letter uppercase. That's what text capitalize does. Now there's a new thing in here in Bootstrap 5 called font size. And this is really, really useful. So if you have text that you want to be larger, you can use font size 2, font size 3, font size 1, and it's just prefixed with .fs. So that's your class, fs1. And maybe as an example, let's see what this is. Maybe this is lead? Oh, no, that's lead. I'm gonna find an example somewhere. Nope, ID. Oh, this is all using proper markup. All right, well, that was a failed example. Let's just go ahead and change this one then. So this is font size 1. If we want to change font size, well, let's look at, first of all, the default. The default, this is regular text, so it's pretty small. We can say the class is equal to font size 4, makes it just a tad bigger, or font size 5 makes it a tad smaller, font size 1 is the biggest. Now, what is a little bit backwards here is, first of all, there are 6 different ones in here. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And in HTML, there's a header 1, so H1, H2, H3, H4, H5, H6, and that goes from biggest to smallest. Up until now, these number modifiers have usually gone from 1 to 5 or 0 to 5, instead of 1 to 6. And it was always like M-5 would be the biggest, so margin 5 would be the biggest margin. This is backwards. This is saying font size 1 is going to be the biggest, like in H1, it has the biggest text. And font size 6 is the smallest, just like in H6, it's the smallest text. So just keep that in mind that that's a little bit backwards. There's also font weight and italics. And this is cool, especially with the lighter text. I really like lighter text personally. I think it can look really, really nice on any web page, really, given there's proper context. But font weight and italics. So there's 2 things to look at in here. First of all, font weight, bold, bolder, normal, light, lighter, and, well, that's it. Just these 5. And then there's this other one, FST. And that stands for font style. So font weight italic doesn't make sense. There is no italic font weight, but there is a font style called italic in CSS. And there is no font weight normal. Nope, that's a lie. There is a font weight normal, but in regards to font styling, you might want to un-italicize some text with FST-normal. There's also line height in here. This is a fun one. LH stands for line height. We're not going to get into that. Monospacing. So if you maybe wanted to make a blog about everything you're learning in this course, you could write a bunch of code and use font monospace, and that just makes it so that every letter is the exact same width. The I is the exact same as the W, as the S, would be the exact same as a W, which is a wide character in English, so on and so on. And that just makes your code look a little nicer. So when you're writing code in, let's say, VS Code, for instance, or Sublime Text or Notepad++, all your code is monospaced. And so developers are used to seeing monospaced code. A regular person for a regular blog, maybe you're writing a blog on food recipes, you probably don't want to use monospacing. That's going to look out of place. But when you're writing code, you will want to use monospacing. It just looks more appropriate. There's reset color. Let's skip over that. And there's text decoration. So if you ever wanted to add an underline, you just type text dash decoration dash underline. You can add a strike through as well. And links by default usually have an underline. And this one is simply saying there is no underline here. So get rid of that text decoration entirely. So what I would like you to do for your task here is play with text alignment. That's important. Another important one is going to be text transform and font size. Play with all three of those. It should only take about 2 minutes, and then head on over to that next lesson. So in the last lesson, I quickly mentioned that containers are really, really important. And it even says here, containers are a fundamental building block of Bootstrap. So essentially how it works is everything goes into some sort of container. Now there's different sizes, and we should be familiar with different sizes, and you can actually read through this. So a regular container is going to be 100%. On small, it's going to be 540 pixels. On medium, 720 pixels. And so there's not quite an exact one-to-one. So if we look at a large device, so if you remember back to the breakpoint lesson in the last video, large was 992 pixels and up. The container is going to be 960 pixels. So it's 32 pixels smaller, so it's going to have 16 pixels on the left, 16 pixels on the right. And we see that with like extra large and extra extra large as well. It's not quite perfect. Now the exception here is when you're using, for example, container extra extra large, and your device is only, let's say, 800 pixels, it's going to take up 100% of it. Otherwise, if you use container MD on a device that's 800 pixels, it's only going to be 720 pixels wide. Now that might get a little bit confusing, but we're going to get some hands-on practice with that in just a little bit. So let's first of all take a look at an example. A container looks like this. It's just div class container, and then we put our content inside of it. And we do that so that we have a nice little containment in here. And can I maybe see if this is in a container as well? So right click and inspect. I'm just gonna make this a wee bit bigger here. And we can see the whole page is in a container, extra, extra large container. It has a margin top and bottom for a medium display of 4, and it has some other class called BD layout. There's also responsive containers. I'll let you read through that on your own. Fluid container is going to be 100%, and we actually saw that up here. Fluid container is going to be 100% of its parent element. So if you have an element that's 300 pixels wide and you use a container inside of it, that container is going to be 300 pixels wide. Now, this is not super useful, not at this point in time, so there is no task, but what we do need to know is that we always have a parent element called a container. And in the next couple of lessons, we're going to look at how we use this. Let's take a look at the grid system. So this is a mobile first flex box grid to build layouts of all shapes and sizes. So the first thing we need to know here is that grids always live inside of a container, and inside of each column is a row. And so we're basically building out a table. So we say, hey, there's going to be a table here. We call that a container. And that first row has 3 columns in it. So we write a row with column 1, column 2, and column 3. Or my favorite column, column Farrell. A little bit of a dad joke there for you. A little dry humor. Okay, so we have a container on the outside, a row on the inside, and we can have multiple rows. We just don't nest them, not yet anyways. And then we have columns inside of rows. How it works, I can let you read through that if you want to. That's kind of boring. Let's get right down to the nitty gritty. So equal width, for instance, if we have a container, this first one here, we need a row. So we've got a little bit of code here, a little bit of code there, a little bit of text. We have 2 columns inside a single row. So the row is the entire thing here. And we've got a column on the left, a column on the right. Now to make them equal width, we simply say col. So we have container. We put a row inside of that container. And then we have a column and a second column. And that makes equal widths. Now, one thing to keep in mind is that when we'll get into this in a little bit as well, but when we're dealing with columns in Bootstrap, we always want to deal with 12 columns. So these ones are auto expanding. So this is going to say there's 2 columns in here, make it equal width. But what we can do, if I scroll down just a little bit here, is we can set the column width. So in here, we have the first one is going to be column, whatever that's going to be, whatever the width is. And that's going to be determined by all the other columns. In the middle, we have column 6. And so that's going to be 6 out of 12. That's 50% of this row. It's always, always, always out of 12. And then we have this third column here, 3 out of 3. And that's just going to be whatever the remainder is. So if we do some quick math here, this row is going to be 12 columns wide. This middle one, we're saying take up 6 of those 12 columns automatically. So it's going to be 50%. That first one over here is going to be automatic. So we know 12 minus 6, we have 6 left. We have 2 on either side and they're equal. So these are going to be 3. So we've got 3 plus 6 is 9 plus 3 is 12. Now what's interesting about this is when we get into automatic column sizing, we can let CSS do all the heavy work or the heavy mathematics for us. So in this example, we have column 5. So it's going to take up 5 out of 12. We have 7 left. 12 minus 5, I got that 5 from down here, is 7. And then we have 2 of equal size on the left and the right. 7 divided by 2 is 3.5. So this is 3.5 and this is 3.5. Now there is no col or col dash 3.5. It only goes col 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So nice thing about that is Bootstrap is automatically going to take care of this column for us. Now let's look at variable width in here. No, we don't really need to do that. No, yeah, let's do that. We can use column with a breakpoint and then put some sort of breakpoint in there. So for instance, this column here where it says 3 out of 3, that's this one right here, is going to be an automatic size. So whatever the browser thinks it should be to fit the rest of its parent container. Except on large devices and up, it's going to be a 2. So it's going to be 2 out of 12. So this is 2 out of 12. 6 of these 3 out of 3 ones in here is going to be 12, and it's going to take up this row perfectly. Let's go ahead and just right click and inspect and toggle our device, and let's keep an eye on this variable width. You can see that's moving down because it's becoming responsive. Let's just keep this in sight, and this is going to get a little bit tricky because there's so much content moving around. Where did you go? Okay, so this is large and up. This is taking up 2. 2 out of 12. If I go down into less than large, you're going to see that it eventually snaps. And it snapped a lot of things, but it also made it a little bit smaller. And let's keep going, let's keep going. I gotta find it again because my whole page snapped. Equal width, setting one column. Here we go, variable width content. Then we said, make it just a full column. And so we're getting into fun responsiveness here. And what this is going to allow you to do is make a page that on desktop looks pretty good. You have content side by side. And where am I? I keep losing my spot here. This is a tricky one to record. So it's going to put all of these side by side. And then when it snaps into mobile view, it's just going to put them underneath each other. So automatically your page is going to be a lot more responsive if you use a container, a row, and a column. Let's see what's next in here. Responsive classes. Kind of what I was talking about anyways, but take a look at this. This one here is a column of 8. This is a column of 4 for a total of 12. So this is going to take up 8 out of 12, or roughly 2/3, and this is going to take up not 1 out of 12, it's going to take up 4 out of 12, or roughly 1/3. But these ones on top, these don't have a col-8 or a col-4. These are just going to be automatically spread out for us. Next up, if we wanted to stack these horizontally, we can have multiple rows. So we can have a container here with our first row. And then if we wanted another row, we could add another row. And so it just looks like this. If we pretend this code doesn't exist, there's a row here, close that row, and then right beside it, there's another row. We can pretend this doesn't exist in here, and close that row. There's a lot of mixing and matching that we can do as well. So for instance, we can say, let's just read through this code actually. I'm not going to say anything, I'm going to read through the code with you. Class container, that's this whole thing in here. There is a row, that's this first row right across here, and col md and up is going to be 8. So on medium devices and larger, this is going to be an 8 out of 12. The next one over here is col 6. So this is saying on all devices, this is going to be 6 out of 12, except on medium and up, it's going to be 4 out of 12. So we're getting into responsiveness here, but the idea is that we have MD8 and MD4, and within the row, we're saying MD is going to equal 12. Now, if the device is smaller than MD or medium, the second one is going to be a column width of 6, so it's going to fit right in the middle here, just like this bottom example. It's going to fit right in the middle. And this first one here, col MD8, is just going to be a regular column, so it's going to take up the rest of the space. So it's also going to be a 6. Now, we didn't specify that it's going to be a 6 because it's just going to snap down to be the rest of the space that it can possibly take up inside of its row. Now let's take a look at row columns, and I think this is a relatively new thing in Bootstrap 5. Bootstrap 4 I don't believe had this. Maybe newer Bootstrap 4 had this, but definitely older Bootstrap 4 did not have this. So we have these things called rows. And we have this entire column in here, and then we set a row. This whole thing is going to be the row, and we're going to say each column has 2 cells in it. So we say row cols 12, and instead of putting all of these side by side, what it's going to do is put them side by side and then stack them. So let's take a look at this. Right-click Inspect, and I'm going to move this up, and we're going to do a little bit of experimenting here. So if I go to row cols 2, and I just grab that text and delete it, this is what it looks like by default. Instead, what we could say is row cols 2, and that creates 2 columns inside of this row, and it's going to stack them for us. We could also do 3. We could do 4, which is the same as doing nothing because there's only 4 items in there. Or we could do 1, and that's going to stack all of them on top of each other. Now let's set that back to the default where it's just row cols -2, and close that down. And that can create columns for us. And we can actually see the example here, row cols 3. I got a little bit ahead of myself, but it showed you a live example of how we can do 3 columns inside of a single row without creating a new row, and it just stacks it automatically for us. If we wanted to, we could do row cols auto, and that's just going to put them all side by side like this. Let's go ahead and inspect this and do a little bit of tinkering around. Let's go ahead and get rid of this. So we'll just call old. This is what it looks like by default. If we wanted them all to be side by side, we could say row cols item, and it puts them all side by side like a regular Flexbox item. What's nice about this is we don't have to write Flexbox, it just comes with our grid. Next up, we also have nesting. Now, before we get into nesting, I just want to give you a little refresher. This is a course about also reading documentation, not just about learning Bootstrap, but also how to read documentation. And at no point in time should you feel like you need to remember all of this. You can always reference the documentation at any point in time. So let's talk about nesting. Nesting is pretty fun when it gets into Bootstrap, and we can nest quite heavily here. So we can have a container with a row, and this first row, or this first column, is right here. Right there, I selected too much originally. The second column is this one here, and it has a span of 9. So this is 3, and then we can see this one here is a 9. Now inside of that, we can have another row, and this one is going to have a column of small and up is going to be 6, so it's going to take up 50%. 6 out of 12 is 50%. And the second one is also going to be 6 out of 12. Now, if we made this page smaller than a small device, so less than 567 pixels, I believe it was, is the breakpoint. This one is going to turn into an 8, and this one's going to turn into a 4. Still adds up to 12. All your columns in a row should add up to 12. It just happens to be that here we have a row inside of a row. So we have a row inside of a row. And in fact, this row is actually inside of a column. And so what this is saying is this column, yes, it has a span of 9 in its global context, but in its local context, in this particular row, this row thinks it's at 100%. And out of that 100%, 50% and 50% are split into cells or into columns. Now, this is a really, really important thing to learn in Bootstrap because you're going to be using grids all the time. If only you use Bootstrap for one thing, it's going to be for the grid layout, not the utilities, not the components. It's going to be for the grid. Now, if you ever just want to use a grid layout, there's another thing called Flexbox Grid, not a Flexbox Grid generator. I don't know why that was in there. Flexbox Grid. And you can go to flexboxgrid.com and it uses the exact same thing. Col XS12, Col SM8, Col MD6, Col LG4. So if you ever just want a grid and you don't want all the extra Bootstrap stuff, that is a great way to just use a grid. Let's scroll on down. What else do we have in here? Just customizations. And that's about it. So your task for this is going to be, I want you to create a new container with a row, and I want you to create a column in that row. The first one should be 8. The second one should be 3. The third one should be a 1. So 8, 3, and 1. Then I want you to make that responsive so that when it shrinks down into a mobile view, so pretend you're on a desk, pretend you're on a phone, so right-click Inspect, click this little icon down there on Chrome. I think it's on the right if you're on Firefox. You're going to want to make sure that all of those stack on top of each other. So it'll be 1, and then 2 will be underneath, and 3 will be underneath, and they'll take up 100%. So go ahead and try to make a responsive container with rows and columns. This honestly should take you about 15 minutes to do. There's a lot to learn in here. Have some fun, practice with it. If you get stuck, ask questions down below. Okay, so here we have columns, but I'm going to skip over this one and go straight over to gutters because I think at this point in time, you're pretty familiar with these documentations, or this documentation, and being able to read through it and how it works. And it all follows a very, very similar pattern. But let's talk about gutters. So gutters look like this. A gutter is the space between two columns. And so what we can say is container, px is 4, so padding on the left and the right is going to be 4. Not 4 pixels, but it's a 4 out of 5. Then we have a row, and then we say that gutter on the x-axis is going to have a 5 gutter in there. And we're going to modify that in just a second. Then we have a column in here with a padding of 3 and another column with a padding of 3. And so typically what this looks like is if we start to experiment here, let's get rid of this gutter x5. This is what it looks like by default. So just default stuff in there. And if we add a gutter, we can say gutter x on the x-axis is going to be a 1. It brings them nice and close together. Or gutter 0, watch this, gets rid of that spacing altogether. And so all we did there was we took that row, we originally had a gutter of 5 in there, gutter on the x-axis of 5, and we got rid of it. We made it smaller, and then we got rid of it entirely. Now there's a number of different things we can do with gutters in here. Overflow, vertical gutters. This is one that we're going to want to work with. So vertical gutter is gutter on your y-axis, the top and bottom. So let's go ahead and let's just inspect, and let's just have some fun with this. So we can see that there's a gutter in here, gutter y of 5. Let's go ahead and get rid of it. And we can see that the row, we've got a row in here, column, 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 and another column. So they're all set to 6. We got rid of that gutter, but if we ever wanted to add some spacing between it on the y-axis, the top and the bottom, we can say gy, gutter y, is equal to 1. Adds a little bit of spacing in there, or a 4 adds a little more spacing in there. And that just spaces out your items nice and evenly for you. So you don't have to work out what that's going to look like on mobile or desktop or laptop or TV or anything like that. It just sort of works it out for you, which is really nice. And this is the power behind using a framework or a library like Bootstrap, is it does all the heavy lifting for you. Let's take a look at horizontal and vertical gutters. So we looked at gutter X and gutter Y, but we also have just a regular gutter, which is G-2 in here. Let's go ahead and experiment with this. We right-click inspect, G2, we can change this to G0 to get rid of that gutter entirely, put it all close together like it normally would, or we can change that gutter to be super far apart. And that goes from 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and not 6, but 0 to 5. Something like that. Now we can also add row column gutters. And so this is getting a little more advanced in here, but let's just read through this. So we have a container, that's this entire thing. We have a row in here, that's going to be, again, this entire thing. That row columns is going to be 2 by default, but row calls large devices and up. I'm on a extra large device right now, an extra large laptop. It's going to be 5, so 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. It's going to have a gutter of 2 by default, but on large devices and up, it's going to have a gutter of 3. So let's take a look at some of this responsiveness in here. Let's change this. Gutter large of, let's change it to 4. You can see it spaces out just a little bit more. Gutter large of 5. It gets really, really spaced out. Let's change this gutter 2, because I'm on a large device, so it's going to overwrite the regular settings. Let's change that gutter to 0. And so what this is saying here is G0 on every device, set it to have no gutter whatsoever. So no spacing in here or in here. But on large devices and up, it's going to use a gutter of 5. Now I'm on a large device, and if I get rid of this, you're going to see that G0 kicks in. Fits them all side by side, there's no spacing in there, and we can do this. So I'm going to undo that. And all that is, again, is just, where are we here? G, and then your breakpoint, and then how big you want that gutter to be. And by default, this was a 3. I changed it, but by default, it was a 3. You can remove gutters entirely if you wanted. Welcome to components. So we're not going to go through all of these because there's a lot in here. But what I want to do is I wanted to set you up for success so that when we get into components, you know how this works. You sort of understand the fundamentals of Bootstrap and reading documentation. So if I go into components, we have accordion, alert, badge, yada, yada, yada. There's a lot in there. I'm not going to read them all out to you, but there's a lot of different things in here. And a lot of these are going to require some JavaScript. So if you go into getting started, introduction, and you just add this JavaScript, a lot of the components will just work for you right out of the box. You might need to activate them, but they will work for you. So if we deal with like an accordion, for example, an accordion looks like this. This is what an accordion is called. And it acts like an accordion. And so we can look at some of this code and start to read through it. This is a little more advanced code. This is longer, but you know how to read through this now. So this whole thing is an accordion. Then we have an accordion item. And we have another accordion item, and we should have one more in here, an accordion item. Then in there we have the header, which happens to be an H2. It says accordion item 1, and it has an ID of heading 1. And we make this a button so that the whole thing looks like it's clickable. Type is going to be button, so it doesn't do anything. This is just regular HTML at this point. Data, Bootstrap toggle, we want it to collapse. And what is that target? We want it to collapse 1. And that is right here, that ID collapse 1. So that target is ID collapse 1, and that comes over to this ID collapse 1. So this is basically just JavaScript. If you look at this, and if you did document.query selector, it would select this ID plus this name, and it would select this entire element. So just some basic JavaScript in there. And then what it's going to do is toggle it. So open and close, open and close. So that is an accordion. Now, there's a lot of different ways we can do accordions. There's a lot of different styles for like alerts, for instance. So we have all these different alerts in here. Alert, alert primary, alert, alert secondary, success, danger, all that stuff. We have all these different alerts, and we're familiar with this already. Primary, secondary, success, danger, warning, info, light, and dark. We've seen these before. And so we're already familiar with this. All we needed to know is that class name, alert, and alert-primary is going to give us this blue one. If we go into badges, this is a badge. So we're not going to go through all of these. We looked at card at one point in time. There's drop downs, there's navigation, there's pagination, there's toasts. This little fella there, that's called a toast. Let's look at a modal. This is an important one. You're going to see these all the time. This does require a little bit of JavaScript as well, but this is a modal, just pops up on your screen, and we can close that modal. Well, that's not activated, but usually we can close that modal if the JavaScript is there. And let's do a live demo. This is a modal. We can click outside of it, modal, close, launch, save. Does nothing because it's supposed to actually do something in your application, but it opens and closes a modal for you. Now, these are all different components that come with Bootstrap, and there's a lot of different things in here. But what I wanted to do in this module, in this course, is I wanted to set you up for success so that if someone says, hey, I'm a designer and I want you to make a card, you would go into cards and you'd be like, oh, okay, this is a card. I know how to make that. And you can literally just copy this code. You don't have to remember all of this. I honestly don't. I don't remember how to do all of that with components. I remember the utilities, that's the important part, and the grid, but how to actually place all of this together is, honestly, I just come here, copy it, and modify as I need it. And likely you're going to do the same thing too. You're not going to be able to remember all of these components. So what I would like you to do is I would like you to spend probably about 20 minutes just going through these. You don't have to read through all of it, but look at some of these fun little examples that they have here. Look at these button groups. Nope, that's not the one I wanted to click. Let's look at drop-downs. There's a button drop-down just like that. What I want you to do is get a little bit familiar with some of these, not necessarily the code, but the example, just what kind of components Bootstrap comes with. Because in your final project, I want you to use a bunch of components, utilities, and a grid to make a web page. So spend about 20 minutes just reading through this and playing with some of the examples, just so you know what is possible. When you're done that, let's head on over to that next video where we're going to talk about your final project. Okay, welcome to your Bootstrap 5 final project. What I want you to do is click on themes, and it'll send you to themes.getbootstrap.com and find a theme and try to clone it. Now, some of these are pretty advanced, and I don't want you to pick anything that's too advanced. So let's pick something easy like this one. Let's click on live preview here, and I want you to try to create just a single page like this. So if I get rid of this bar here, we can see this exact page. Try to create a page like this. Now, the content in there could be anything. I want you to not worry about the content. Don't worry about the images or anything like that. It doesn't have to be a photo of a person. It doesn't have to have a nice little background in there, but it should have a good layout. So you need to use your grid system. You're going to want to use a navbar component, a jumbotron component, another grid system with 3 items in here, a bunch of cards, and these cards are probably going to look a little bit different than what you have with generic Bootstrap, and that's fine. You can totally use generic Bootstrap. You don't have to worry about customizing it. It has a title, it has a view all, it has all sorts of stuff in here, it has a little footer. I want you to try to replicate a page like this. When you are done that, I want you to then take a photo, or take a screenshot rather. Please don't take a photo with your phone, it's so hard to see, but take a screenshot of your project and share it with the class. Now, all in all, this whole thing should probably take you a few hours to work with if you're brand new to Bootstrap. And it does not by any means need to be perfect. It doesn't need to look amazing. It doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be functional. The other thing you want to make sure is that when you right-click on the page and go to inspect, let's go ahead and close that or make it smaller. It should be responsive. So what happens when you do this? It should be responsive. You see how all these sort of snapped down? Look at that. So there's 4 in a row, there's 2 in a row, now there's 1 in a row. I want you to work on things like that as well. This should take you a few hours. And those few hours are going to be very, very vital. A lot of websites in the world use Bootstrap. It is fundamental that you understand how Bootstrap works. Go ahead and try that out, and if you have any questions along the way, feel free to leave them down below, and I'll be happy to answer them at any point in time. Have some fun with this, make it yours, own it. I want you to make sure that you are happy with what you're making. And it doesn't have to be about anything in particular. We're not worried about the content. But if the content gets you fired up, gets you excited, gets you motivated and inspired, feel free to pick a topic that you love. Maybe you love making popcorn and you want to make a website all about making popcorn and has a bunch of different tutorials in here about proper ways to make popcorn with a popcorn machine or something like that. Or maybe you love skateboarding or skiing or snowboarding. Maybe you like writing code. Maybe you're just excited to write code and you want to use this as like a developer blog. Go ahead and make anything you like. The important thing is that you use a lot of different components, such as a card. We have different buttons in here, which we didn't cover, so you're going to want to look at buttons as a component. There's a navigation with drop downs in here. You're going to want to take a look at that. There's what probably is Flexbox in here. So you have one item on the left and all your items are on the right. So you want to look at display flex and you want to make sure it's responsive. That's the hard part, is you want to make sure it's responsive. Now I would say just go step by step. So just work on making a navigation. It doesn't have to have all the same content either. It can have like one drop down and then like maybe a search box or something. Just one is fine. And then work on your hero section. That's this color section up here. Add a title, add some subtitle, maybe add a couple of buttons, add a nice photo or something if you want, or a background image. Then when you're done that and it's responsive, move on to this next section. Then when that's done and responsive, move on to the next section. Go ahead and try that out. You have my full support. I am 100%. I'm a 100% believer that you know everything you need to know now to use Bootstrap very efficiently. You learned all the hard parts and the components are the fun parts. So now you just get to work with the fun parts. So go ahead and have some fun with that. Last but not least, if you are interested in some support in a Facebook group, you can always join the Learning to Code Facebook group. We are here to help. You can ask any question regarding Bootstrap. You'll probably get an answer within 3 minutes, tops most likely. I also answer a lot of questions in the Learning to Code Facebook group. And please don't forget to take a screenshot of your entire page, or there's a little plugin here for Chrome at least. It's called Go Full Page, and it takes a screen capture, gets the whole page in there, and you can just like right click and copy or save that image and post it down below. Last but not least, I am Caleb Tallien. I have been your instructor in this course. I hope you have learned how to read through documentation and you feel comfortable with Bootstrap at this point in time. You can always follow me at Caleb Tallien on Twitter or coding.for.everybody on Instagram. Have some fun with this. Thanks for taking my course, and I hope to see you in another module of mine.